Hi guys, thank you for visiting my channel. Today's video has been requested by a few people, so I decided to make a video out of it. So I moved to Japan about 3 months ago now, and when I got here it was the end of October. It was actually Halloween, and so the quarantine is very different now than it was back then. I'll go over my experiences when I was in quarantine back then. So first off, I'm a Japanese citizen, so my quarantine was different than how foreigners had to go through the process. So, for example, when I was coming here, at that point, I did not need a PCR test that showed that I was negative. I know at that point in October, if there was foreigners coming back to Japan, you needed a PCR test showing that you were negative with COVID. The person in front of me in line didn't have that PCR test, so they weren't allowed to come back to Japan. And also at that point, the only people allowed to come back to Japan were people who had valid visas already or who were permanent residents of Japan. Not many people were on my flight. Maybe around 15 people total. I'm not quite sure. There was only a few people that got off with me, so I know when I got to the quarantine section, it was not very crowded. So going to the quarantine section after the plane, we were handed a few documents, so I have them in front of me today. The first one was this. This is all in Japanese, so you probably won't understand it. But in here, you had to put in your name, where you're coming from, also like if you were feeling any symptoms of COVID within the past 14 days, what countries you're coming from. On the top here are all the different countries listed. And they also had one in English as well. This one's in Japanese. I used the English version, which is why I still have it. And then they ask you about, once you get to Japan, what are you going to be doing? So here they're asking you where you're going to stay, if you're going to stay at a hotel, if you're going to stay at your house, where was your house located, how are you going to get to your location, all of that stuff. And then there was a Line. So you could have set up your Line account. Line is a messaging account for those who don't know. It's very similar to like WhatsApp, WeChat, but Line is Japan's version. I think it's also very popular in Taiwan as well. So you could have set up your Line for the quarantine check-ins. At this point, I didn't have a valid working phone for Line. My phone was all American, and I was about to change my phone number and get a new phone because a lot of the Japanese apps did not work on my phone. I also didn't have a Japanese valid phone number at this time, so I had my dad's flip phone, which I used as my phone for my phone number. So I didn't do this Line part, it's not necessary. And then this part is just kind of explaining what was going to happen once we got to the airport. So this was all given to me on the plane itself. So once I got off the plane, we were led one by one to this section where we weren't allowed to do any video or anything. So I have no video footage of anything over there. So we were taken to a room for all of our documents, and we had to do our test. So once we got to the next room, they were just confirming our information on our test, and we had to fill out our application saying where we were coming from, all the basics, where we were going, why we were coming there, if we were staying, things like that. And then we just had to go to the PCR check. So at this point, I think it is still now. Today is January 31st. So I know things are very different now than it was 3 months ago, but I'm again saying my experiences from 3 months ago. it was a spit PCR test. So we were given a vial about like this big-ish. And we had to put our spit into it about halfway. So there was like little cubbies lined up, and you were supposed to just spit into that bottle and then close it up. And it had a number on it, so we just gave it to the quarantine officers once we were done with that, and we went to the next process. So this part of the process did not take very long. I couldn't read Japanese, and my Japanese level was not to that point yet, so I didn't exactly know what was going on, so I kind of saw what everyone else was doing and just followed suit. And then after that, we had to get more documentation done. So we went to another room where they were checking our documents. So they were double checking with us how we were getting home and getting our phone number so they could contact us. Once we were done with that room, we moved to just a waiting section. It took about 45 minutes-ish to have our test done. So I was just waiting there. I had my phone, they have chargers. It was just like in the regular part of the airport. So at this point, they didn't have those beds, no snacks, nothing. It was a really fast process. I know as of right now in January, they do make you go to a separate hotel while you're waiting for your test results. But again, at that point, it was all done in the same day. So we had a number for our test. We got a paper like this. I'm just gonna cover the parts where I think might be confidential here. And it kind of just says like how long would your quarantine be. So for me, it would be October 31st to November 14th, and I was staying at home. And we were supposed to monitor body temperature every day, making sure we didn't have any symptoms. And it gave us a QR code for consultation, and this was all in English. So anyone who needed English translations, there's also a foreign language part that you could talk to. So on the top of that sheet, it said my number. So once my number was ready, there was a screen that said all the numbers and when they were ready, and they would announce numbers 600 to 700 are now ready. And we got in line, and there was a counter with a few people there, and all they did was just give us our test results back. Mine was negative. After we got our test results, we had to go to immigration. So we had all of our documents for immigration, and we also had a paper that confirmed that our COVID test was negative. I don't know what happens when your COVID test is positive. I think they put you to a site where you would be monitored and for your COVID, where you'd be monitored for COVID, but for me, I was negative, so I was able to go the regular route. I went to immigration, showed them my negative PCR test, and they let me go on to get my luggage. Once I got my luggage, it was already off the luggage carousel, so I was able to go past again through customs, and I had no issues, so I was able to go past by. I had a I had a quarantine taxi ready for me, so I reserved mine through MK Limo, and they had everything covered. I do have a clip of play it right now, and during this time, it was a little expensive. I think it was about $200 US dollars for this taxi ride to get to my next location. It was pretty expensive, but I didn't have any other choice. If you have family members, you could have your family members pick you up, but for me, I had no family in Japan, so I couldn't do that option. So I got my own quarantine taxi. And they had the windows down, they had a plastic wrap, you had your mask, they had some drinks in there as well. So I'll put the link to where I got that taxi in the description below. So after I got off the taxi, I stayed at a hotel my first night. I got there really late at night. It was probably about 8 p.m. at this point, and my apartment wasn't ready yet. It was going to be ready the next day. So I stayed at a hotel very close to my apartment, and the next day I just walked all my belongings over from the hotel to my apartment. Because I couldn't use any public transportation and I needed special quarantine taxis, I made sure to stay really close to where I was living to make sure that I didn't have to get in contact with anyone else. And so I moved over to my apartment, and once I was in my apartment, the only time I left was for food and for basic necessities. Going back to before, for the line, they also had this thing called Kakao, which is how they were monitoring COVID at the time. It was an app that a lot of people here have. This is a little bit more information about the Kakao app, but again, I didn't have a Japanese phone at the time, so I couldn't do that. And here is talking about like what the quarantine experience is going to be like. So again, the step 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll just give you a little outline of how the quarantine process would be like. And with a quarantine, at that time you weren't allowed to use public transportation, which is why I had to get a quarantine limo or quarantine taxi. But you were still able to go out for basic needs, so I really only went out to get food or basics. I needed to get some groceries, some basic things. So when I went out, I didn't use any public transportation ever. Again, this might have changed, but at that time I was allowed to go out just for basic needs. They also never checked up on me, so even though they had a phone number for me, I never got any calls, nothing from them. It was radio silent. I know for foreigners, they checked up on them a few times during that time. I had a few friends also going through the quarantine process, and the government had called them a few times on the phone. But for me, I guess it's because I was a Japanese citizen, they never called me for anything. So they were very lenient on the quarantine process, which is probably why the cases flew up again. But again, when I was doing my quarantine, it wasn't that serious. So I was still able to go out to get food. I made sure I didn't go on any subways, didn't use any taxis. I used the Docomo bikes if I really needed to go a little bit further, because sometimes they didn't have everything I needed in my general vicinity that I could walk to. So I would use a bike, and then always had a lot of sanitizer everywhere, and I didn't see anyone during that time period. So that's kind of a little bit more of my quarantine experiences. If anyone else has gone through the quarantine experience, please let me know how your experience was as well, because I know mine was probably very different than someone else's. And I know right now, almost being February, they've changed the quarantine process a lot more. For example, if you are a Japanese citizen as well, now you also need to get the PCR test ahead of time, and foreigners as well. Right now is only permanent residents are allowed in Japan, and the quarantine has gotten a little bit more serious since when I had to go through this process. I'm hoping this was really helpful for you all. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them out in the comments, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Okay, bye! I did forget to mention before, my flight I was coming from New York, JFK, and I was arriving at Haneda Airport in Tokyo.